Hi, welcome. Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Is someone? Welcome. I someone there.
Hello, Doc.
Is someone?
Wow, ይሰማል። Thank you.
በጣም ጥሩ። ተማሪዎች አንድ ቦታ ነው ያሉት ወይስ በተለያየ ቦታ ነው?
አይ አንድ ቦታ ናቸው ያሉት። ሁላችንም አንድ ላይ ነው ያለነው።
ኦኬ፣ ይሰማል ግን በደንብ
በቪዲዮ ነው እንታይም እንዴት ነው?
አሁን ትታያላችሁ።
ሰላም እያሉህ ነው።
ሰላም እንዴት ናችሁ? የሽማግሌ ሰላምታ እንደዚህ ነው። ኮሮና የለም እንደዛ። አይ ማስክ በጣም ተቀራረባችሁ ሳያችሁ። በጣም ጥሩ። let me እንትኑን ለሞክር ስክሪኑ ይታያል የሚለው
ያው ፕሮጀክት አድርጌ ነው።
ኦኬ
ፕሮጀክት አድርጌ ነው። ትንሽ የድምጽ ጋፕ አለ መሰለኝ። በደንብ አይሰማም በብዛት ስላሉ ተማሪዎች።
አሁን በደንብ አይሰማም እንዴ?
እሺ ይሰማል እያሉ ነው።
በደንብ ካልተሰማ ያስቸግራል። ይታያል? በጣም ጥሩ። በእንግሊዘኛ ነው እንግዲህ የምናስተምረው። ኦኬ ሶ ሞዴሬተር ብኖረኝ ጥሩ ነበር። ብቻዬን ነው ያዘጋጀሁት፣ ሰው አላዘጋጀውም። that's why I have some problems.
ያው ትንሽ ኢንትሮዳክሽን ነገር ላድርግና አንድ 15 ሰከንድ ከሰጠኝ።
እሺ
ያው ኦፍ ኮርስ ኢሜይሌ ላይ አሳውቃለሁ። ዶክተር በዱ ጀረኔ ይባላሉ። ሲኒየር ኤፒዲሚዮሎጂስት ናቸው። በኤንሲቢ ቱበርክሎሲስ ፋውንዴሽን በሚባል ኔዘርላንድ ሀገር ነው የሚሰሩት። ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ብዙ ፕሮጀክቶች አሏቸው። ፕላስ አርባ ምንጭ ጀነራል ሆስፒታል ላይ የመጀመሪያ ኤአርቲ ክሊኒክ ኢንትሮዲውስ ያደረጉት እሳቸው ናቸው። በተለያዩ ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች ኦነራሪ ስታፍ አፖይንትመንት አላቸው። አሶሺየት ፕሮፌሰር ናቸው። በብዙ ፐብሊኬሽኖች ያሏቸው ናቸው። ብዙ ነገር ከሳቸው ትማራላችሁ ብዬ ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ። ዶክተር እንግዲህ በጥቂቱ የተወሰነ ኢንትሮዲውስ አድርጌያለሁ። ምናልባት በተጨማሪ የምትጨምረው ነገር ካለ?
ኧረ ቢቀንስ ይሻላል፣ እንዲያውም በዛ።
እሺ ዶክተር።
እሺ በጣም ነው የማመሰግነው። እኔ አሁን ዋናው እዚህ ፕሬዘንት የማደርገው አርባ ምንጭ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ባለኝ አፊሊዬሽን ነው እና I'm very happy to be part of my local institution። ትልቅም የምኮራበት የአርባ ምንጭ የሰራሁበትን ነው። Especially with the introduction of ART program in the country። እና የመጀመሪያ ሆስፒታል ነው ባይ ዘ ወይ ደቡብ ውስጥ ART ሲጀምር 2003 ጁላይ ላይ እና አሁን እንደ ቀልድ እንዲህ የሚታየው በጣም ከባድ ነበረ። እንደ ኮቪድ ነበር HIV ያኔ። Okay, so this course is I don't think I will cover everything on interventional studies because it will take a minimum of 5 days to cover the whole course. But I will give you some overview with understanding that you already had some exposure to it and you have completed your courses. But we can also continue to discuss this after the lecture if you are interested in this area. So I'll give mostly of some overview and some practical aspects instead of talking much about theories. Did say someone Badam? Badam. So this is the objective of the course. By the end of this session, you are expected, to be able to explain key concepts and applications of randomized trials. So I'm using the word randomized trials because this is a typical example of interventional study. And I will also be talking mostly about drugs and clinical trials. But this doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to other interventional studies. So please understand that my focus will be mostly on randomized clinical trials, but the principles apply to almost any kind of interventional study. So the second objective is to explain the defining characteristics of a randomized controlled trial. And I also expect that you'll be able to describe the key steps in randomized controlled trials so that you will be able to design them and also be able to explain ethical issues in randomized trials. So these are the learning objectives of this session. Okay, so let's go to recap of study types in one slide. I start by defining epidemiology. I know this is very elementary for you, but it's important to understand when we talk about study types. So epidemiology is a study, right? And a study about distribution, determinants, and disease frequency in humans. So we are now talking about distribution, determinants, and disease in human population. So any other population is not the concern of this topic. And it also combines, it's not only about distribution, determinants, and disease frequency in humans. So epidemiology is also about the application of this study to control health problems. So this summarizes the way how epidemiology is defined. Then the word study is divided into two. One is surveillance and the other is epidemiologic research. So surveillance, the purpose of surveillance is to monitor aspects of disease occurrence and the spread that are pertinent to effective control. And epidemiologic research its purpose is to harvest valid and precise information about the causes, preventions, and treatment for disease. So when we talk about disease, it's not only about illness, So disease may mean a broad array of health-related states and events. It can include diseases per se, injuries, disabilities, and sometimes we also categorize deaths as disease. When you study case fatality rates, mortality rates, we are talking about death rates. So that's why in the definition of disease, we also include all this. I believe this is not a waste of time because this is important to lay the foundation for all the studies. So epidemiologic research encompasses several types of study designs, including experimental studies and observational studies. So the focus of this session today is on the experimental studies. It may not be very visible, but this is an important classification. There are many ways to classify these study types, but this one is particularly important because, as you see here, it depends, the study type depends on the exposure assignment. So if there is an exposure assigned by an investigator, then you go to the experimental study group. If there is a random allocation of that experimental study group, then you have a randomized controlled trial. If not, this is a non-randomized, but still a controlled trial. So experimental studies are not necessarily randomized trials. They can be non-randomized trials as well. And then when you go to the observational study category, most of the studies are observational, by the way, and they are very helpful. So it depends also on a comparison group. So if there is a comparison group, then you classify this as analytical study. So if you don't have a comparison group, this is a descriptive study. So there is always a confusion, between descriptive studies and cross-sectional study, but they are different. So if you have a comparison group, then you look at the direction of the study. So if you are starting from exposure to outcome, and then this is a cohort study. If you are starting from an outcome and go backwards, then this is a case control study. If you are making a snapshot of comparison at the same time, then this is of outcome and exposure, this is a cross-sectional study. So this clearly divides your study. And this is an important element, by the way. Whenever you write your proposal or your paper, you have to explain and describe the study type and the study design. Okay, so to the main topic, to the randomized trials. So the randomized trial is considered the ideal design for evaluating both the effectiveness and the side effects of new forms of intervention. So the intervention can be a treatment, it can be health education, it can be a policy change, it can be anything, it can be a surgical intervention, whatever. Other terminologies can also be used. It can be randomized clinical trial when it is specific to clinical trial. You can also call it experimental study or interventional study. So we use these terminologies interchangeably. Okay, so let's go to the history of randomized controlled trials. Does anyone know when the randomized controlled trial was started? I can see your hands. If you can shout at and you can say, I know it was started 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Anyone who volunteers? Let's make this interactive also. ይሰማል የማወራው ነገር? Okay, so in silence, a minute develop. Okay, let me continue. So I just wanted to make sure that we also interact. So this is not a recent science, by the way, randomized control trial. It's not. It's a very old science. So the first experiment was done in about 6,000 before Christ, I think, in the Holy Bible. And this is documented, by the way, in science. It's not, I'm not talking about a religious understanding. It was done so the first investigator was Daniel in the Bible. And the second one was the most recent, the more recent one was done in 1757, I think, or 47, on the scurvy experiment. So I will explain those a bit. So this is Daniel, and this is James Lind. So if you look at this literature, which was published in 2003, this is an editorial written by one scientist complaining that trials done by Watson and Lind were not the first scurvy experiment. He's saying that in the book of Daniel, reference is made to the unwillingness of the Israelite Daniel to accept the diet offered by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. So the king's official had put a stone in charge of Daniel. So what they did was, what Daniel had requested an experiment, and he wanted to eat. He didn't want to eat the food given by the king. And after 10 days, those who ate the vegetables and cereals had a better health status compared with those who ate the meat and other proteins. So this is the first experiment, and this is documented in many epidemiology books, and this is always cited as the first randomized trial. And this is a fascinating example. When you come to the James Lind, this is a more popular than Daniel is. This is a scurvy. Patients had some strange illness in 1747 in a sheep, and they didn't know how to treat this. So there were 12 patients, and this surgeon, so this is a surgeon, he's not a nutritionist or any other scientist. So he divided these patients into 6 arms, 2 patients in each. And for one group, he gave 2 oranges and a lemon per day. And for the others, he gave them all forms of drinks, including the water and laxatives. So this is an interesting study. The sample size was just 12, but he had 6 arms. And he saw a significant improvement in those who took orange and a lemon per day. So that is the first study which showed that scurvy is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. So this is the first experiment, just to give you a historical overview. So let's go to, so now we have a more advanced description of a design of a randomized trial. So the basic design is as shown here. So you should have a defined population first, and then randomization should be there, which is a key. And then you give a new treatment and compare it to the current treatment. Okay. And then there will be improvement, the outcome measurement in both cases. But there are many variants. So this is a simple two-arm randomized trial, but it could be, there are also several variants, and 2 are mentioned here. One is the crossover design, and the other is so the other is here, the factorial design. So I will explain each of these in brief, but I will dwell more on the several steps involved in conducting a randomized control trial. So this is a simple 2-arm randomized trial. as you see here, a simple two-arm randomized trial. So what you do is you have a defined population here, and then you select a sample from here. Okay, and then you have a key factor here, the randomization. And after randomizing them, you give them either treatment or placebo. So that is a classical experiment, but you can also compare treatment 1 with treatment 2. And then you follow them prospectively and measure occurrence of disease, yes or no. So this is the classical design of a two-arm trial. But when you have a crossover design, what happens is the selection of the sample is the same. Okay, the randomization doesn't change. And then you have a placebo and treatment, or the other way around. And then we have a washout period. So this is important. After giving the treatment, you discontinue, wait for some time, and then you switch the treatment into placebo group, and this placebo group into treatment group, and then you measure outcome. So this kind of factorial design is, crossover design is mostly done when you have a limited number of participants. Right now we are planning something similar in Arba Minch, by the way, on our own study. There is also another way, more economical way of designing a study. You can also do factorial design where you can combine two interventions. So drug A and B, then you have drug A with placebo B, placebo A with drug B, and then placebo and B. So in the comparison, what you do is you compare separately. You don't compare them combined. So you combine your drug A, all drug A's together. You have drug A here, drug A here. You combine this together, and then you have placebo A, placebo B. So in your analysis, you compare this. And then you have drug B and drug B here, right? And then you compare placebo B with placebo B. You combine. So this is more complicated design. This is also to use one sample to determine treatment outcomes of two different interventions. So this is a bit complicated, but this is to be more economical and to get some time efficiency in it. Okay. So the comparisons can also be either single arm or they can be multiple arm comparisons. So the one I just showed you on the lemon experiment is a bit weird because we had 12 patients and they were divided into 6 arms, and that's the smallest sample size one can have, I think. But still it provided some information, by the way. And so sometimes the sample size is also a very subjective thing. This will not be discussed here, but it's also important to note that. Okay, the type of hypothesis we can test in randomized trials also, they vary. It could be a superiority trial. So in a typical two-arm trial, we can talk about comparing A with B, or comparing A with placebo A, or it can be an equivalence trial. You can say that, well, I have a treatment, a new treatment, which is as good as what is being provided. And your justification could be that it's cheaper. So you can also do some kind of equivalence trial. Or you can also confirm that, try to confirm that your treatment is not worse than the other treatment. So this kind of comparison are possible, but the commonest one is comparing for superiority of any intervention against a standard of care or another treatment. Okay. So here are the steps. This is one important point that I want you to understand. The 6 steps are displayed here. So this is a basic design of the trial that I showed you, of a 2-arm trial. And this is step number 1. So you do your sampling, you select them. And then at baseline, you measure your the predictors. And optionally, you can also take some specimens. It could be a biological specimen, and you can store them at baseline so that you can compare them at the end, or with the outcome values. And then there is randomization, and then applying the intervention and following up. Then you measure the outcomes. So these are the basic steps in a controlled interventional study. So let's go into each of them briefly, because that's the core of this session. So the selection of a participant begins with deciding what kind of participants you want to study and how to go about recruiting them. So in the protocol, that's why we write, entry and exclusion criteria. So these are some of the factors that you should know when you select some trial. The rate of the primary outcome. So it should be a common outcome. Otherwise, you will be recruiting patients for 20 years. So if this is something very rare, then it's not a good idea to do an experimental study. You can do some case control or some retrospective cohort study to find out, because that's more efficient. We should also have some understanding of the expected effectiveness of the active treatment. So usually before you go to a full-blown randomized control trial, what you have to do is you should have some preliminary results from small-scale studies or from observational studies. And you have to put that in your literature review and show that there is some effectiveness. Otherwise, this will not, your study will not be approved unless you show some evidence. So some pilot work is always important. And generalizability of the findings. If you are using selecting very isolated group of patients, and it's not representative of the broader society, then it's also useless. So that's also important. And ease of recruitment. And so you should be able to catch all of this your patients, and they should be available to be recruited and to be followed up. And compliance is also important. When during treatment follow-up, if you are recruiting, say, HIV treatment among female sex workers, for instance, that can be a very challenging work because they move from place to place. Or if these are long-distance truck drivers, then you will not be able to track them if they go to Djibouti and stay there for 3 months. So this is also important when you recruit patients. These are some of the things that you have to consider. And then you have to design adequate sample size and plan the recruitment accordingly. So these are some of the hints here. Important point is the patients, the patients selected participant should be at high risk for outcome. So for instance, if you are going to try a malaria treatment, then you have to go to a place where there is high risk for malaria. Otherwise, you will not show, if you are looking for a prophylactic treatment, you will not show any impact. And the impact of this treatment should also be a benefit. So if it's harmful, then you shouldn't try it. And you have to also check some adherence level based on some preliminary data. So the participants who are likely to adhere should be selected. Okay, so sometimes you will be forced to exclude some participants from a clinical trial for a number of reasons. One is if it's harmful to the patient, then you have to exclude. So exclusion criteria include one of these. If you think the active treatment is not effective for a specific group of patients, say for patients with severe illness or for comatose patients or patients with comorbidities, then you shouldn't try this in these patients if you already know. So that's unethical. If you think they are unlikely to adhere, then they should also be excluded. And if you think they are unlikely to follow, to complete follow-up, they should also be excluded. And if you know that these patients have practical problems with participating, then that's also another reason for exclusion. So these are the points that you write in your exclusion criteria when you do that, when you plan your study. So after that, after recruiting patients, what you do is you measure baseline variables. So what do you include in your baseline variable collection? You'll focus on collecting, start with tracking information. So this is important. We usually overlook this. But if you don't know the address, the phone number, the contact person, and the exact details of these patients in your trial, then it's unlikely that you will be able to track if they are lost to follow-up. So that's important. You should also take other socio-demographic characteristics of patients at baseline. And you should have your variables, the risk factors as variables. That's a crucial component. And if you can do that, for example, if you are taking a biological sample, then you have to also establish the banks of materials. And then you should also measure the outcome variables in some instances. For example, if you are measuring a change in CD4 value at the end of 6 months of treatment, or if you are measuring a viral load, or if you are looking at positivity rate for tuberculosis, or if you are measuring a hemoglobin value, anemia as an outcome, then you have to measure it at baseline so that you'll be able to measure the outcome at the end. For dichotomous outcomes, it's also important to exclude presence of outcome condition at baseline, because if you don't exclude this, if you don't have rigorous ways of excluding the outcome condition, you may end up overestimating the outcome in the study group. So it's also important to focus on essential baseline variables. So it's good to be aware of the resources you have. You don't have to measure everything in the world. So focus on a limited but relevant variables based on your literature review and also practical aspects. Okay, so we come to a key concept here. So we have reached the randomization stage of a clinical trial. So randomization is, so in simple words, it means tossing a coin to decide the assignment of a patient to a study group. So this is the cornerstone of a trial, and it must be done correctly. So for patients, it's tossing a coin and selecting a patient, but sometimes it can also be selecting a cluster. So in bigger cluster randomized trials, which I believe most of you will be doing as public health officers, randomization is also done, randomization of cluster of areas is done more in a public way. There is a ceremony actually when you randomize two sites. If you want to randomize one of the districts into intervention and the other into control, then that has to be done officially in the presence of all key stakeholders, and they should be aware. And sometimes there are conflicts that arise even during randomization because of perceived benefit of some of the intervention. So that's important. So why do we do this random assignment? Because it assures that age, sex, and other prognostic baseline characteristics that could confound an observed association will be distributed equally. So unless you randomize, you may end up, having a selected group, one group, deviating towards the control and the other in the intervention. So that will completely destroy your trial. So the critical element of randomization is the unpredictability of the next assignment. So nobody should be able to predict that the next patient will go into a control or intervention arm. So the purpose of randomization is to assure comparability of treated and comparison groups on key known and unknown potential bias and factors. So that is crucial. So without randomization, there is no randomized trial. So important features, these are very important. Randomization includes that the procedure should be truly, random. So allocation should be done randomly, and that assignment should be tamper-proof. This means it should be proof to manipulation. No one should manipulate, not the investigator, not the patients, not the data collectors, not clinicians. So neither intentional nor unintentional factors can influence the randomization. So this is an important concept. So the tamper-proof is very important. Before randomization, participants must also complete the baseline data collection, be found eligible for inclusion, and give consent. So this is important, by the way. We always focus on the randomization concept part, but unless you collect also some information before randomization, your reporting will be incomplete. So there are certain reporting requirements. And unless you specifically measure all the baseline information pre-randomization, your report will be incomplete. And that's a common mistake, by the way. After investing so much on clinical trials for 3 years, you end up having only your randomized patients, and nobody knows how many of your patients were first assessed for eligibility, how many refused, and how many were enrolled. So that's crucial. We can use either computer algorithms or a set of random numbers to allocate random numbers. Once you have generated a random number, then you have to apply them. No more manipulation. So that's a crucial step in a study. So just to give you a practical way of a single site randomization, I will leave this, let me use this classical old way of doing it. So what you can do is you can generate random numbers and put them in a sealed envelope by someone who will not be involved in opening the envelopes. So ideally, this person should be also based in a location away from your study. If you are doing a study in Arba Minch, then it's better to do this to be done, by someone based in Addis Ababa or in somewhere in other parts of the country, or preferably even outside the country. Then it has to be transported. Yeah. Then each envelope must be numbered and opaque. So this is when you do this, the typical handmade way of randomization. When a participant is randomized, then his name and the number of next unopened envelope are first recorded, and then there should be a witness, and it should be signed. So this is very important. Otherwise, the investigator can manipulate. If the investigator is sponsored by a certain company, for instance, he or she can manipulate and generate false results that can, promote a certain product. So that's why it's very, very important, and it's in fact it's a legal issue. So once this is opened, and then once patient is assigned, you have to record it on a log. so that this is also included in the analysis. So these are important practical steps. So for multi-site trials, this is a bit more complicated. This can be done mostly by a computer program that provides treatment assignment. So you generate the IDs, and the IDs are sent to the study team. You know, the study team has no control over which patient. So whenever the patient comes, we just pick the code, and the patient is either in treatment or control arm. So there are several special randomization procedures, including block randomization, stratified block randomization, adaptive randomization, and randomization of matched pairs. These are a bit more advanced, but especially the block randomization is an important one. So block randomization is called a restricted randomization or randomization with balance. When you have a small number of participants, then it's good to use this kind of block randomization. The idea is to ensure that you have equal numbers in each group after fixed numbers of allocation, so that you don't run out of participants without equally allocating them. So the size of the block must be a multiple of the number of interventions. The block size should not be known to the investigator, and you can use several different block sizes. So you can use block size 4, and next time you can use 6, so that the investigator will not be able to predict, what the next allocation will be. When it's a small sample size, this is just to show you an example of a randomization. If you have, say, you have an A and B, 2 interventions, and to be allocated using a block randomization of, say, 4, it's possible to list all the different possible combinations. These are the possible combinations. You have 6 combinations, and then you can add corresponding numbers. So if the corresponding number is 1, then this is a patient goes, the first 2 patients go to intervention A, and then the next 2 go to B. This one to B, and then A, then AB, AB. So these are the combinations. So to show you an example, you have these random numbers on standard epidemiology textbooks, and say if you just randomly throw your pen and press it on number 7 here, then if you read it down, you can see that you have 7, 1, 6, 1, 8. Okay. So these principles, they should be written in your protocol, by the way. You can't, so that you don't manipulate them. So if you put this one, and then as you see on 7, there is none. So you discard this. And 8, there is none. So your 3 patients, the 3 patient blocks that you will recruit, the first patient will go to A, the second will go to A, and then B is over. So this is a practical way of doing randomization using random tables. But larger block randomization, you can't, do all this listing. You have 252 possible combinations. So I advise you to look at this directory of randomization softwares available, and this is more and more commonly used. You can use this also for a smaller randomizations, but this is more appropriate for a bigger studies that have different combinations. Stratified randomization, it may also increase the likelihood of comparability. So an example I can show you here, when you can stratify your group into male and female, so that you have equal amount of participants from each group. So this is another crucial way of randomization. So we have now reached the place of applying the interventions. Once you have randomized, then you have to apply your intervention. So in a clinical trial, what you do is we compare the outcome in groups of participants that receive different interventions. And we have seen that this is, you administer either treatment against contra placebo or treatment against another kind of treatment. Okay, so the randomization patterns, we have already dealt with it. And another important key defining characteristic of a randomized control trial is blinding. So blinding is a procedure in which one or more parties in a trial are kept unaware of which treatment arms participants have been assigned to. So this is also an important aspect of a trial in order to avoid and prevent conscious or unconscious bias in the design and execution of trials. So it can be an open label, no blinding is possible, okay? Or it can be single blind, only participants are not aware of the treatment. So you can give them anti-TB medication, and then the other group can just receive a placebo or multivitamins or any dummy drug. Or it can be double blind, where both participants and investigators are not aware, or it can be a triple blind, so where persons who perform the tests, outcome educators, and safety monitoring group, all of these people don't know what's going on. So only independent people outside the study who don't know about the study plan are aware of the blinding procedure. So they should be available to disclose it when it is needed or at the right time. I'll let you. Okay, so I know it's a long lecture, but so let's go, and I will take also a few questions. So
can you make your sound a bit louder?
Can you hear me now? How about now?
They are saying yes.
Antes ይሰማሃል ራሴ?
እኔ ቅርብ ስለሆንኩ እየተከታተልኩ ነው። ይሰማኛል። ያው ራቅ ብሎ የተቀመጡ ስላሉ።
ኦኬ ቴክስት አድርጋ ሜሴጅ አድርገልኝ ነበር እንደ አልሰማሁም፣ ግን እንደዛ ችግር መኖሩ ነው።
መጀመሪያ ላይ አሁን አይደለም፣ መጀመሪያችን በፊት ነው ቻት ያደረኩት።
ኦኬ አሁንስ ይሰማል ግን?
ይሰማል።
በስመ አብ ከደከመኝ በኋላ ትነግረኛለህ።
ኖ አይ ኋላ ያለ ሰው ድምጽ ትንሽ ምናምን ስላለ ነው እንጂ።
ኦኬ ችግር የለም። I will shout. Sorry, I will also share the slides.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so blinding is the main purpose is to avoid co-interventions. You know, there are always unintended effective interventions. If you know that your patient is on a certain treatment, and if you want your treatment to be effective, you give extra care to your patient, right? And your data collector wants also to please you by, trying every effort to have this patient a better, outcome. So that's why we blind them. If you know this is an under treatment intervention group, then you start to give extra care to this patient. So this is called co-intervention. There are many unintended co-interventions provided, and they completely destroy your treatment outcome. And there are also other forms of bias. So what happens if you don't blind your participant? What happens is participants may report symptoms or outcomes differently. They may say that the new treatment is causing this problem, the new vaccine is affecting me. So this kind of problem can be reported, And physicians or other clinicians may also elicit symptoms or outcomes differently. And the study staff may also classify, similar events differently. If you give a corona vaccine, for example, to one patient, and if you give a placebo, and if you know that one patient has received corona vaccine, and then they may say that, oh, he had headache. See, if you don't like the vaccine, for example, you may, manipulate. So these are human errors that can be introduced. So that's why we have to update. But blinding can be difficult sometimes. For example, if you are comparing surgical intervention with medical treatment, obviously, which patient has received the surgical intervention, and you can't classify that. So this is a kind of problem that you may face with blinding. Okay. So these two concepts are very important. So I'm writing them in bold, and so that you will not forget them for the rest of the day. Or if you already know it, you will always have a clear understanding. So randomization eliminates confounding by baseline variables. And blinding eliminates confounding by co-interventions. The co-interventions include unintended interventions. So this is a crucial concept. It's a crucial concept. Okay, almost, yeah, we have 6 slides and we have about 10 minutes or 7 minutes. So during follow-up, what we do is we ensure adherence to the protocol. That's crucial. So unless you have, you patients, or it can be a population, by the way, it can be community members, unless they adhere to your interventions, you will end up having unpowered, underpowered, or biased results. So in order to maximize adherence to your protocol, you should have an active role. You initiate a trial, and then you can't just go away and come back just to get results. You have to play an active role, starting with choosing the right subject, as I said in the baseline, making the intervention also easy so that patients don't run away. If it's painful, they will not come to you back. So you have to explain it, be good enough, friendly. Make study visits also convenient and enjoyable. Provide some refreshment, if that's not inducement. Make study measurements painless and interesting. Encourage subjects to continue in the trial and find subjects who are lost to follow up. So we always tend to report that our lost to follow up, we just take it as for granted, and we just report the lost to follow up. But we have to search for lost to follow up patients and find out the true outcome. Sometimes lost to follow up patients can be dead, but they may have also moved to somewhere else. They may have started another treatment. So this is important active role that as an investigator you have to follow. So in addition to this adherence monitoring, there is also monitoring of a trial, especially if the trial is a big one, there is a monitoring group for a trial. So this is, so during monitoring, we look for recruitment, adherence, blinding, if it's being done, and follow up, and also look at the important variables. If the trial is a small one, you yourself and the study team can do, be a monitor. But for bigger trials, I'm sure you are aware, some in Arba Minch we have big trials. Then there should be an independent data monitoring board. And that should be approved by the IRB also. So they have to be available. So what they can do is, so the outcome of the trial, sometimes it can be devastating also. even for a well-designed trial, it can be termination of the trial. If it is causing a lot of problem to the patients, then you can be forced to terminate the trial. Or if you have another evidence from elsewhere that this treatment is already working and there is no more study needed, then you have to stop it. So a good example is from the recent past is a trial on the use of male circumcision, for example, for the HIV prevention. It was terminated very early because they found benefits, early in the trial. There are many examples. Or you can also modify the trial. You can stop one arm of the trial and continue with the others if there's multiple arms. Or you can add new measurements, or you can also discontinue high-risk participants and focus on the ones who have less risk. Okay, so we can also change sample size and so on. So monitoring depends on several factors, but it should be adequate to ensure that you have adequate time for monitoring. So finally, at the end of monitoring and doing everything, you have to measure the outcome. So when selecting an outcome, which should be in your protocol, by the way, a crucial one is its clinical relevance is important, its feasibility is important, and its cost. Sometimes you measure clinically relevant measures, like, for instance, days, hospital admission. These things they are also objective measures. So as much as possible, it's good to measure this objectively. If you measure this, you can take days per se, but you should also know the cause of this. So these are important. You have to have accurate and precise assessment methods. Sometimes you have to use criteria to say this one, the outcome was favorable or unfavorable. So you need precise ways. Some variables can be continuous measurement variables also. And the number of outcome variables. We usually focus on a single primary outcome to calculate the sample size, but you can also include a number of secondary variables. So analysis of randomized control trial. The analysis is more like that of a cohort study with relative risk. There are two important terminologies to understand. Intention to treat analysis is important. This is how it's reported in clinical trials, intention to treat and per protocol. So this is a most conservative interpretation of your analysis. Here you include all persons, irrespective of their compliance to the treatment. Once the patient is randomized, then you include the analysis. Okay. Then you can also do subgroup analysis, but that has to be specified in the protocol. One slide on key ethical questions in randomized control trial is very important, especially with new drugs. The key questions that you can include whether it's possible to do randomization. If it's a proven treatment and if it's in your national guideline, then you cannot do any randomization. Okay. And you have to also check if truly informed consent can be obtained. These are key questions. And you have to also know whether it's a placebo control trial is ethically possible. If you have a proven treatment for a certain condition, for malaria, for example, at this point in time, you can't do any placebo trial for treatment because we already know we have a treatment, or for HIV. So placebo control trial is for something without any treatment today. Also, you should have clear plans on when to stop trials, as I said, with the monitoring of the clinical trial. there should be a plan for stopping. So I advise you, if you have not seen this book, Designing Clinical Research, it's a nice book. You will find a lot of information for clinical research, but it's also highly relevant for all forms of clinical trials. And I will be sending out this PowerPoint to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your time and a very detailed presentation on topics which are very relevant, practical, and from which we learned a lot. We really appreciate. If any question, I may give chance to the audience raise.
So by the way, I don't know which stage you guys are in. If you are planning your MPH thesis for the next term, we can also have some chance to discuss issues like how to determine the sample size, more practical issues, not only for clinical trials, also for cohort studies. So please feel free to schedule another short meeting in the future.
Okay.
I'm available.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, I am happy on behalf of the epidemiology and the biostatistics units that you are available for us to help us. I really appreciate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please ask questions next time. Thank you. Someone.
Okay. I triple blind
አሁን አይሰማም። ዝቅ በል ትንሽ ወይ መልካሙ ጋር ጠጋ በል ወይ በዛ
አይ ጥያቄ ምንድነው? ትሪፕል ብላይንድ ላይ ማለት ነው። ቅድም ስለ ታይፕ ኦፍ ብላይንዲንግ ሲናገሩ ትሪፕል ብላይንድ ላይ ፓርቲሲፓንት ኢንቨስቲጌተር እና ስታቲስቲሻኑ አያውቅም ነው የተባለው እና ካልታወቀ ማን ነው ኢንቨስቲጌት የሚያደርገው? ሁለተኛ ደግሞ ሶስቶቹ ካልታወቁ ፋይንዲንጉን እንዴት ነው ማግኘት የሚቻለው?
ፋይንዲንጉ መጨረሻ ላይ ዲስክሎዝ ይደረጋል። አንድ ሰው በሚስጥር ይሄን የሚከታተል ሰው አፖይንት ይደረጋል። አን ኢንዲፔንደንት የሆነ ሰው ለዚሁ ፐርፐስ ከአጥኚ ቡድን ሌላ የሆነ ኮሚሽን አይነት ማለት ነው ቁጭ ብሎ ነው ይሄንን ሞኒተር የሚያደርገው። So this is usually done for a big studies እና ትልቅ ስታዲ ስለሆነ ፉል ታይም ይሄንን የሚከታተል አለ። ኮድ ይዞ ነው የሚከታተለው። መጨረሻ ላይ ግን ኮዱን ዲስክሎዝ ያደርጋል ያሳያል ማለት ነው። እና there are times also ዝም ብሎ ሁሌም ደብቆ አይቀመጥም። ለምሳሌ ፔሸንቱ ሲሪየስ ሳይድ ኢፌክት ዴቨሎፕ ያደርግ ያ ሰው ይሄንን ዲስክሎዝ ማድረግ ግዴታ አለበት። ይሰማል አይደለም?
አዎ ሰማኝ።
እንደዛ ነው የሚደረገው።
ሌላ ጥያቄ አለ? They are saying they do have any more question. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Malcolm, for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day. Bye.